Hello guys, Mr. B here. Welcome to the latest in the series of lessons on the labour market. So having looked at the demand for labour, we're now going to be turning to the supply of labour. So today's learning outcome is to be able to understand the factors that affect both the supply of labour and also the significance of the elasticity of supply for labour. Now, as ever, at the beginning of our model, we outline our assumptions. Now, you might think some of these assumptions are a little bit contentious, especially in 2020. Bear in mind that a lot of this economic theory was written quite a few years ago when the nature of work was quite different to what it is today. So we are assuming that the individual has a choice between work and leisure. And we're also assuming that the nature of the work may either be boring or may well be unpleasant. And this was certainly the case back in history. If you think of the nature of work, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, where workplace accidents were very common, unfortunately, deaths occurring in the workplace. And so the nature of the work wasn't very nice. So it was a reasonable assumption to think that workers were working in order to get paid. So the notion that people like work, that people enjoy work, and they do the job that they do because they enjoy it, is a bit alien to mainstream economists, at least those that wrote the theory that we are studying here. So it is a bit of a product of its time, but go with it, and maybe we can start criticizing the assumptions a bit later once we've learned it. Now, I should have said right at the beginning here, of course, remember that the labour market, in a sense, works the other way around to the goods market. So when we're thinking about supply of labour, don't get confused by that word supply. It's the individuals that are offering their labour. So it's the households, it's the individual people that are offering their work effort, their supply of labour. So individuals supply with the labour market, and it's businesses or employers that demand. So here we are going to first of all look at the supply of labour for the individual, not for the whole market, but just for one individual worker. So wage rate on the y-axis, the hours of labour that the individual chooses to work are on the x-axis. So here we're going to be studying two effects which you have to understand in order to understand the supply of labour function: the substitution effect and the income effect. So in order to understand why the supply of labour curve initially looks as it does on the screen here, we've got an upward sloping function. So as the wage rate offered increases to W star, the hours of labour increase to Q star. And this is because of something called a substitution effect. So if we get a rise in the wage rate to W star, there is a rise in the opportunity cost of leisure. So if you've got a choice between work and leisure, effectively leisure becomes more expensive with a higher wage rate, because if you take an extra hour of leisure, then you forego more and more in the wage rate that you would have got paid. So you're giving up a higher wage by taking more hours of leisure. So leisure becomes more expensive, and individuals therefore substitute work for leisure. That means they take more hours of work and they take fewer hours of leisure. So initially, the individual supply for labour function is upward sloping. However, you will notice that it is non-linear. And in order to understand this, we need to understand another effect, which is called the income effect. The income effect is saying the opposite of the substitution effect. The income effect is saying that the higher the wage rate, the fewer hours of labour you have to offer in order to achieve perhaps a target income or a given income. But up to and including W star, the substitution effect outweighs the income effect. So both effects are going on. You've got a substitution effect and an income effect going on, even on this first part of the curve. But the point is the substitution effect is dominant. Beyond W star, the supply of labor function slopes the other way. So we have what's called a backward bending labor supply curve. So the labor supply curve is backward bending. The reason for this is that the income effect begins to dominate. So above W star, individuals realize they can work fewer hours to achieve a given target income, and so they substitute leisure for work. Again, the substitution effect is still there beyond W star, but the income effect dominates. So beyond W star, the income effect outweighs the substitution effect. So there are sort of two mini learning points here within this one slide. One is to get your heads around both the substitution effect and the income effect, because we will see this in other parts of economics as well. And the other one is to be able to learn how to draw the backward bending labor supply curve for the individual worker. So that was the supply curve for the individual. We now turn to the supply curve for labor in a market. And we'll take the example of car assembly line workers that we used for demand. The good news here is, again, we don't need to learn the complex derivation of the market supply curve from the individual supply curve. All we need to know is what the market supply curve for car assembly line workers would look like. So just have a think, press the pause button, and see what you make of this one. What would the market supply curve for car assembly line workers look like? This is for the market, so for the whole car assembly line workers. So hopefully you got it. The good news here is the supply of labor in the market is pretty much identical to the supply of goods function that we've seen in the goods market when we've studied the goods market in other parts of economics. So we have a linear upward sloping supply curve. So we're assuming here that the substitution effect dominates. So if we get a rise in the wage rate from W1 to W2, we get an expansion along the labor supply curve from E1 to E2. And the reverse would also be true. If there was a reduction in the wage rate from W2 to W1, there would be a contraction along the labor. So having looked at the market supply curve for labor, we now turn to what factors would shift that supply curve. So what factors other than the wage rate would affect the market supply of car assembly line workers? So the number of workers in the whole car assembly line market. Have a think about that, press the pause button and see what you make of it. So one is the number of qualified individuals. So if we think about PINTS WC, which is the acronym for the shift in supply in the goods market, then the number N is the number of firms in the market. The more firms there are in a market, the more supply there is in the goods market. So it's the same with labor. The more qualified individuals there are in a particular market, the higher the supply of labor will be. And the fewer qualified individuals, the less the supply of labor will be. So if we go, if we think beyond the car assembly line example, you might think about particular occupations where the number of qualified individuals is very small, maybe less than what is required. So there may be skill shortages in certain parts of the economy. So we might have skill shortages, for example, in engineering, possibly in medicine, and lots of other different jobs. One is the non-wage factors in the job. So the non-wage factors are the things that would attract you to a job apart from the wage rate. So it may be if there is a very good pension, for example. It may be that the perks of the job are very good. You might have holidays. You might have a company car. Anything that attracts you to the job that is not the wage rate itself. So, for example, in teaching, a lot of people are attracted to the teaching profession because of the very good pension that is still on offer in that profession. And substitutes are going to be important as well. So workers have a choice, sometimes at least, have a choice between different jobs or different occupations. So the wages and conditions in other jobs are going to affect the supply in a particular occupation. So this graph just shows what would happen if there is a shift of change in any of the conditions from the previous slide. So if there is a rise in the market supply of labour to a car assembly line, then the curve will shift to the right. So we get a rise in the quantity of labour at any given wage rate, for example, W1. And the reverse is also true. If any of those factors shift supply to the left, then supply would shift from S2L to S1L, and the quantity of labour at each and every wage rate would. So let's now think more generally about factors that affect supply of labour in the, for example, the UK labour market in general. So across all occupations, what factors affect perhaps the decision to work at all, as opposed to taking hours of leisure? Have a think about this and press the pause button. And answers coming to you in 3, 2, 1. So taxation could be one. So if employees are taxed more, if income taxes go up, for example, or if national insurance contributions go up, if it pays you less to work, then individuals are going to offer less labour. Maybe they'll choose not to work. So remember, this is a factor that is different to the wage rate. This is going to affect net income or disposable income rather than gross income, rather than gross pay. So this factor would actually shift the labour market supply. So if tax rates went up, then the supply of labour function would shift left, all other things being equal. And if taxation went down, then the labour supply curve would shift right, all other things being equal. And similarly, benefit levels. So if unemployment benefit becomes less generous and it pays you less to take leisure time, then individuals will work more. So a fall in benefits would mean supply of labour shifts right. A rise in benefits would mean supply of labour would shift left. Immigration and emigration are going to have a big impact on the overall market supply of labour in the whole economy. So more immigration is going to raise the supply of labour, particularly in certain occupations. So lots of occupations that rely on migrant labour, perhaps in agriculture. Plumbing is quite a good example. But other examples where we might have skill shortages met by migrants, for example, in the NHS, that will affect supply of labour in those markets. And thinking more generally and more long term, social trends. So really over the last 60 or 70 years, the UK economy has had increased female participation in the workforce. So this too has raised the general. So finally, what factors affect the elasticity of supply of labour? Again, press the pause button, have a think about this one. Answers coming to you in 3, 2, 1. So you can apply the acronym TRIBES, which we used to describe the elasticity of supply in the goods market in the case of the labour market. It doesn't tally exactly one for one, but there are similar sort of factors. So one is the level of unemployment or spare capacity in the whole economy. So if you've got 3 million unemployed workers and demand for labour goes up, it's going to be very, very easy for the jobs to be filled because you've got lots and lots of unemployed workers to fill those jobs. So supply will be very elastic if you have very, very high levels of unemployment. On the other hand, if the labour market is very tight, if there are very few unemployed workers, then no matter what wage rate you offer, there are going to be very few extra workers forthcoming to work at that higher wage rate. You just don't have the workers. So the higher the unemployment, the more elastic the supply of labour. The lower the unemployment, the more inelastic the supply of labour. Elasticity of labour is very closely linked to mobility of labour. And there are two different types of mobility of labour. occupational and geographical. So occupational mobility is, do the workers have the skills, maybe the qualifications? Do they have the ability to actually move jobs? This is not quite the same as the number of skilled workers, which was a factor that would shift the supply curve. It's the skill set of a given working population. So if workers don't have the skills, then again, it doesn't matter what wage rate you offer them, the supply of labor will not be forthcoming. So if there is low occupational mobility, supply will be very inelastic. If there is high occupational mobility, then supply will be much more elastic. Then we find that we've got geographical immobility of labor. So if workers are happy to move around the country, if they are very geographically mobile, so if workers are happy, for example, to migrate from north to south, then supply for labor in the south will be very elastic. On the other hand, if there are things like family ties, social ties, if families don't want to take their children out of school, or if they have strong ties to the local community, they don't want to leave that local community, then supply will be very inelastic. Labor will be very, very immobile. So the more mobile the labor force, the more elastic the supply. The more immobile the workforce, the more inelastic the supply. And finally, also affecting elasticity is time. Time is always an influence on elasticity. So over time, then the labor market will tend to work better. Individuals will become more mobile. They'll develop the skills, or they'll become more and more willing to move. And so over time, supply tends to become more elastic.